everybody. Really excited to be here. Always excited to talk about back gardens. It's one of my most favorite topics. So today I was going to talk a little bit about why back gardens are important, what a back garden is, just in case you're not sure. And then I was going to jump into some recommendations for prepping and maintaining your back garden through the fall and the winter seasons. All right, so let's do this. All right, so bats need our help. BCI, along with a couple of other partners, worked on a report called The State of the Bats. It just came out a couple months ago, and it was just aggregating all the data and information about all the bats in North America and trying to understand what was going on with as many of them as we could. Through that report, they estimated about 52% of the 154 bats known in North America are actually at risk for a severe population decline over the next 15 years. Which is pretty staggering to think about. So over half of our bats in North America are at serious risk. And, some of these, we have a documented population decline that's happening or that's been happening. Some of them are listed as endangered, some are listed as threatened, and then some are on their way to being listed. So, more than anything, we just really want to stress that bats need our help now more than ever. And so much of that comes down to all of you. So we're really glad you're here. So why are bats at risk? There's a lot of different reasons. In the United States, these are kind of the main issues that bats face. White nose syndrome is a whole thing to talk. I think there is a webinar next month. The Bat Chat next month is going to be all about white nose syndrome, which is a very interesting topic and it's really complicated. So that should be great information. And I'm happy to talk about that more, but I'd rather leave it to our white nose syndrome experts at BCI. Climate change is obviously an issue for everything, including bats. And, we're trying to understand how climate change is impacting these bat populations. And it's just multifaceted at so many different levels that it's very, very complicated. There are issues with wind energy and bats. For several different reasons, bats seem to be attracted to wind turbines, and there are often fatalities of bats around wind turbines. And we are working with the wind industry to try to understand that and to try to prevent those losses from bat populations. And then the last issue is kind of a thing that's happening everywhere is we are building, there's constant construction and habitat destruction happening and habitat loss. We are building on everything. Humans are just constantly increasing our footprint everywhere. So there is a large, just continuous loss of habitat throughout the United States and other places too. That does impact our bat populations. And this is where the idea of a bat garden really comes in. This is something that you can do, a very tangible thing, like Karen said, that you can do to kind of mitigate some of that habitat loss. And one thing I did want to make a point of noting is that in the United States, I saw a lot of you are from all over the place, which is really cool. Most of the bats in the US are insectivorous, which means they eat insects. So they are fantastic, and we love them for that because they are this wonderful natural pest control throughout most of the United States. I will say we do have pollinating bats that do feed on nectar in the southwestern United States, in the desert Southwest. So I saw if some of you are from like Arizona, parts of New Mexico, Texas, California, you may have those nectar bats, which is really cool. And then you can actually plant things to attract those pollinating bats. But generally the idea with bat gardening is we want to plant things that support the insects that our bats are eating. Because again, most of our bats are eating bugs. And, they eat a lot of agricultural pests too. A study came out a few years ago that estimated that bats save the ag industry about $20 billion a year. That's billion with a B, because they're eating so many things that are pests to our agricultural crops. So they're doing us a fantastic service for free, natural pest control. And that's why, that's what we want to think about when we think about bat gardens. Okay, so you love bats now. Hopefully you love them already, and you know that they need our help. So how can you help them? Well, just as this little bat says, let's make a bat garden. Let's talk about what that is. So I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the idea of gardening for pollinators, gardening for birds, gardening for wildlife in general. And we really want to just include bats in that conversation because bats are all over the country. They are everywhere. You may not realize it, but you probably have bats in your neighborhood. They're very, very ubiquitous, and they're just, hard to see. They come out at night. They're kind of cryptic. So they're not animals that we generally interact with. And these are interesting statistics that I found, sort of my soapbox on why we should do this, we should garden for bats, why we should garden for wildlife. About 83% of us in the US live in urban and suburban areas. These areas are generally not very good, obviously, wildlife habitats. Sorry, they're very developed, there's not a lot of space. And I looked at this figure came from 2015. So this number has gone up since then. But there's an estimated 40 million acres of lawn in the United States, pretty much all in these urban and suburban areas. And it looks like these pictures where, you've got grass, generally not a native grass, cut very short. There's a few trees, some shrubs. Usually these aren't native plants. These are things that people buy at the big box stores. They don't support our native insects, and therefore they don't support wildlife. So, these suburban and urban areas can be kind of ecological deserts in some sense when they look like this. And this is something where, since many of us are crammed into these areas and we're all kind of living in these spaces, this is an opportunity for us to create habitat in urban and suburban areas to support wildlife, to support bats. So we want to take this lawn and we want to change the narrative, shift the paradigm, if you will. So we don't want the sad bat, we want a happy bat. So with gardening for bats, the main thing, as I said, most of our bats are eating insects, and we want to support these insects with native plants. Native plants have co-evolved with these insects. They have very connected relationships, and they support the native insects that our bats are going to eat. So when you're thinking about bat gardens, there's sort of two things you want to think about. One is providing roosting habitat, and that's in the form of trees, sometimes structures, other things like that. But you want to make sure that there's areas for these bats to roost. And then on the other side, you want to think about food. And again, just planting the native plants that support our native insects that provides food for these bats. So really thinking about structure as well as food, and then adding those two things together, and that's a bat garden. And it can look a lot of different ways. Even if you don't have a lot of space, you can do this. So how do you provide food for bats? What kind of plants are you thinking of? So as I said, I'm sure a lot of you think about pollinators when you're picking out things for your garden or your yard. We just want to think about nighttime pollinators, the things that are coming out at night to visit flowers and fruit and things like that. That's what the bats are eating. So things that are really fragrant, things that bloom at night, that smell really good, that attract a lot of insects. Those are the things we want to look for. A lot of flowers, keep their flowers open all the time. And that's great. Some flowers actually close their flowers at dusk. Some open their flowers at dusk. So you just want to pay attention to kind of see what your flowers are doing. And obviously for bats, we want to kind of look towards the things that keep their flowers open all the time or open their flowers later in the day, because that's going to attract those nighttime pollinators. Things that are lighter colored, white flowers, yellow flowers, those bright light colors, those really pop in a landscape for those nighttime pollinators. Those are the things that really attract them. And then, bats eat a lot of different insects, but they do eat a lot of moths in general. So you can get really, really into the weeds and really nerd out on moth host plants. And there's a lot of information out there about butterfly and butterfly caterpillar host plants, but I feel like there's more and more information coming out about, what plants to plant for moths. And moths actually have really interesting and very cool and weird caterpillars that are just fascinating to observe. So, if you look at your region where you live, Google moth host plants for whatever region you live in, you'll be surprised. You might find some interesting stuff. And a lot of times it's things that you already have planted because you're planting for pollinators or other species of wildlife, or it's things that are easy to find. So, it's all very connected. And once you start doing this, it really benefits everything. And then the last thing I wanted to mention is, I mentioned before that bats are this amazing pest control for the ag industry, but that also extends to our, personal gardens too. If you have an organic garden, you don't use pesticide or herbicide, bats are going to eat a lot of the things that we consider garden pests. That's some of their most favorite food, actually. So I just had a couple of examples of things that might show up in your garden that you probably don't like, but bats eat the adult form of these very well-known, very annoying garden pests. And so that's just something to think about. If you have an organic garden, planting these native plants around your organic garden is great because have pollinators in the daytime visiting those native flowers. They also visit your crops too. And then at nighttime, the native plants are going to have lots of insects coming off of them. Then in turn will attract bats, and then hopefully they'll eat some of those garden pests too. So it all very, very much complements itself very nicely. So the first question with back gardens, how do I know if it's a native species? Sometimes you can really get into fun arguments, especially with plant people, on what's native. I am in Austin, Texas, and you can talk about, like, is it native to this county? Is it native to Central Texas? Is it native to Texas as a whole? Does that count? Where do you draw the line? It's really complicated. You can feel free to get into the weeds about that if you want, but I will say, if you go to these websites, if you go to the NWF Native Plant Finder, is really helpful. Here in Austin, we have the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center. They have a really fantastic native plant database where you can actually just look up your region, look up where you live, and it'll suggest plants to you. I also highly recommend, there's probably a Native Plant Society chapter near you. You might already be a member. Those are your plant people. Those are the people you're going to want to connect with, ask them questions. They have so much knowledge about what grows well, how to help things grow, where to find native plants, because sometimes that's really difficult depending on where you live. So, seek out your Native Plant Society, get to know those people. They will teach you so much. And then, as I said, a lot of people buy things from box stores, and that's not always the best place to get native plants. So try to find your local nurseries and ask questions. Ask your local nurseries, like, what's what. And then also, if they don't have the native plants that you're looking for, you can ask them, and just kind of keep asking and create that demand. And that's going to, make more of these native plants available to the public, which is great. So, keep on it, keep searching, and just get to know your plant nerds in the area, and they will get you very far. But it's always kind of that's the main thing. We just want to plant these native species. Okay, and then some other things to think about with back gardens. I mentioned roosting habitat. Trees are really fantastic. We love oak trees and willow trees. Native fruit trees like cherries are great too. There's a ton of different kinds of trees you can plant for bats. And within that, we also want to think about other roosting habitat too. So there's this idea of vertical layers, which is this picture here. So as I said, even if you have a small space, you can actually create quite a bit of habitat in that space if you think about vertical layers. So it's just planting something in every layer of the canopy that you can. You're creating a lot of different niches for things to live, and it supports a lot of different insects too. So vertical layers are your friend, and you can do a lot with very little with that kind of mindset. And then some bats really like to roost in dead trees. It depends on the species, but if you can leave dead trees up, that is great for bats. And I know sometimes it's a safety hazard, and that's not something that people can do. Totally get that. No judgment at all. If you can leave it up, great. If you can't, and you have to fell the tree, if you can leave the rotting wood, the logs on your property, that rotting wood attracts a lot of insects too. And it also provides habitat for a lot of different things. So at least leave the wood if you can. If you can, leave the tree up, that's great. And you might even get bats roosting in your dead trees, which is very fun. All right, so now to the meat of this presentation. So winter is coming. What should you do? What should you do with your garden? I'm going to talk a little bit about what the bats are doing in the winter, and then I'll get to some of my recommendations for the best way to kind of prep your garden for fall and winter. So what are the bats up to? Well, a lot of you are from all over the country, so the answer is it really depends. It depends on where you live, and it depends on what kind of bats you're talking about, what species. Some of our bats will hibernate. They go into caves or other structures, and they hunker down for the winter. Bats are really amazing hibernators. They're able to kind of shut down, a lot of their systems in their body, or really slow things down. So bats usually have a really high heart rate of about 200 to 300 beats per minute. When they're in full hibernation, their heartbeat lowers to about 10 beats per minute, which is very slow. And they can go over a minute without even taking a breath. So they actually lower their energetic costs 98% when they're hibernating, which is amazing. Bats are just really, really good at hibernating. Sometimes they will wake up when they're hibernating. If it's warmer out, if they're in kind of a more southern climate, sometimes they'll wake up, maybe get a drink. In certain cases, if it does warm up, if it's kind of getting, later in the winter, early spring, they may come up. If things are flying, they may come out and try to kind of find some food. But in general, when they're hibernating, they're pretty hunkered down, especially if it's quite cold. Some of our bats migrate. Some of them are just like, you know what? I don't want to deal with this. I'm going down to warmer climate. I totally understand that. Winter is not my favorite thing in the world. So some of our bats will actually just move on through and spend the winter in warmer places. And then some bats might do one or the other. They have a choice. Some bats, sometimes they hibernate, sometimes they migrate. Sometimes bats do kind of a mixture of both. So it really depends on the species of bat. But that's kind of what the bats are up to starting in the fall and then heading into winter. And then the other question is, what's the food doing? What are the insects doing? They're not doing what's in this picture. I just thought this was a cute cartoon about bats in the winter or bugs in the winter. But a lot of insects, they overwinter is what we call it, or they go through diapause or quiescence in kind of colder temperatures in that time of the year. So sometimes they'll overwinter as an egg. Sometimes they'll overwinter in larval form or pupal form. And then sometimes as full-grown adults. So it really depends on the insect, but the insects are there. Even though it doesn't feel like there's anything out there in the winter when it's cold and everything seems dead, they're just kind of in this state of rest until things warm up again. So the food is kind of taking a break too, just like the bats. So the first thing I recommend, and I will say before I kind of go on any further, a lot of these recommendations are straight from the Xerces Society. So their website is xerces.org. They are an invertebrate conservation nonprofit. They have amazing information about ways to support insect populations and invertebrate populations on the land. So a lot of these recommendations are them because supporting the insect populations is supporting the bat food. And that's the main thing about a bat garden. So this idea of leaving the leaves is huge. A lot of these overwintering insects actually will hunker down in leaf piles in whatever form they are in that moment. Sometimes eggs, sometimes pupal, whatever. They're going to hang out in the leaf pile because it provides kind of that shelter and that warmth. And I know, the urge is to just rake those leaves, get them out of the way. I grew up on the East Coast. I spent so much time raking leaves as a kid. My dad loved the free labor of making his kids do it. So I get it. There's that urge to rake the leaves up, bag them, shred them or whatever, and put them on the curb and have the trash people come pick them up. But if you can leave them, at least in some places, or at least move them, if you have paths or kind of stuff you want to clear out, that's fine. But move the leaves to kind of an area where they can just kind of stay. So the whole thing is just do less, which is great, right? We love being told to do less. I mean, lawn maintenance is a lot of work. So, you can avoid shredding those leaves. If you're going to keep them, or if you're going to move them or you don't want them, at least try to keep them whole when you're doing it and try to move them to the side instead of shredding them, which can obviously kill a lot of insects. And then don't mow the leaves either, because again, that's going to be very disruptive to all these insect communities. So just do less. Leave the leaves for all your yard, or at least for some of your yard. And then that will make a big, big difference to insect populations and then to bat populations in turn. And then I did want to mention the eastern red bat, because you can't talk about leaf litter without talking about eastern red bats. They are just the coolest bats in the world. I mean, there's a lot of bats in the world. There's over 1,400 species, but eastern red bats are amazing because they actually hang out in trees. So they're solitary tree roosting bats. They don't roost in caves or anything like that. They usually hang out on their own. But in the winter, they kind of make a choice. So sometimes they will migrate south. Sometimes they'll decide to hang out. So in certain areas, if it's not that cold, they'll kind of hunker down in a tree. They'll curl up. They'll just look like a dead leaf. You'll never know they're there. They'll hang out in that tree. Once it's sort of kind of it's not that cold, but it's chilly. If it gets really cold where they are, they actually will drop to the ground into the leaf litter and curl up in the leaf litter. And that's what this picture is here. So you can see they blend in so well. It's kind of amazing. You'd probably walk right past that and never realize there was a bat hanging out there. So this does happen in different parts of the country. It kind of depends on where you live, but just know if you leave the leaves and you have leaf litter in your yard, you might be supporting a bat that's just trying to make it through the winter. And if you're walking through the woods in the winter, just step lightly, because you never know, there might be a red bat there, which is just super cool. And this is a Bats Magazine article from, I think, 2004. So you can actually read the article on our website. I think it's still there. But it's a really cool just adaptation of this one particular species of bat I had to mention because I just think it's so neat. Okay, the next recommendation is to just embrace the scruffy. And by scruffy, I mean, let go of the idea of your yard looking really neat and tidy. I think, the idea of a lawn and very like manicured landscape it's very much like deeply ingrained in people and like what we want things to look like. But if you can let that go, your yard can be really, really amazing habitat for wildlife. So, leaving the leaves definitely goes along with embrace the scruffy and just kind of letting the leaves be there. Other things to think about. So if you've got like dead flowers or dead plants, that have died in the winter, our first urge is to just cut them back, right? Cut it down, get rid of them, make it look nice. But if you can leave these hollow dead stems, just leave them up as they are, they actually are habitat for certain species of insects, particularly some of our native bees. And, I know everyone loves honeybees. We're always talking about saving the bees. Honeybees are not a native species. They were brought over to the US. They actually are kind of outcompeting and replacing some of our native bees. And our native bees are the best pollinators for our native plants. And they have a really important role in our ecosystem. So some of them actually will like nest in these little hollow stems and hang out there sometimes. So it's really important if you can leave those stems, that's fantastic. And it may look a little scruffy, but that's okay. Just know you're doing a good thing. Brush piles are really important too. If you do end up raking your leaves, if you can just kind of leave them in a pile, if you have sticks in there or other things, brush piles provide sort of this wonderful little habitat for a lot of different things in the winter because it'll keep things warm, provide food for certain things too. So if you kind of leave a brush pile and just don't worry about it looking a little scruffy, like that is great too. And then as I mentioned before, having dead wood or dead logs, dead trees on your landscape, it may not look, like a perfect cookie cutter lawn, but it's actually providing a lot of different habitat for insects as well as potentially bats too. So just let go of the idea of having a nicely manicured lawn. I mean, who wants that anyway? That's boring. You can support all sorts of wildlife by just kind of letting your yard be a little bit more natural. I know it's hard at first, but once you get into it, it's great doing less yard work. Like that is a good thing. Okay, and along with embracing the scruffy, I did want to make a quick note about palm trees. So I know they aren't everywhere in the US, but where you do have palm trees, there is the urge for people to give them what we call a haircut, which I guess it's not hair, but people like to cut this part off, these dead palm fronds that hang down at the bottom. And, I think that sometimes people do this maintenance in the winter, sometimes they do it before storms or something like that. But those dead palm fronds are actually really important habitat for certain species of bats. So this is a northern yellow bat right here, this little cutie. They love to hang out in dead palm fronds, as well as other species too. So embrace the scruffiness of your yard, embrace the scruffiness of your palm trees if you can, and just leave them like this and just know that you're providing habitat for bats. So that's just something to think about too. Okay, other recommendations, just continue to think about and offer habitat diversity to the wildlife in your yard. I have a couple different pictures here. You've seen this one before, so thinking about vertical layers, this still very much applies in the winter, and having these beautiful layers in the summer. You can also have them in the winter, obviously, and it provides habitat for lots of different things. This is not a picture from the winter, this is from the spring. Clearly, this is my yard in the spring, but I didn't mulch here in this bed, and I'm not going to, because I think sometimes people tend to mulch a lot, and mulch is not always the best thing because actually, if you have ground nesting invertebrates or insects, if you mulch, you might potentially cover them up and they might not be able to get out. So bare ground is actually really important for certain species of insects and certain species of insects that bats love to eat. So adding bare ground, I know it's kind of against our nature to kind of not mulch things and make it look nice, but if you can provide some bare ground, that's actually really important too. And then this last picture is snow in Texas, which does happen sometimes. We've actually had some really crazy winters the last few years, but just showing you kind of the different habitat. This is my yard. And as you can see, I've embraced the scruffy. It is not neat and tidy. I've got a brush pile here. There's some grass here. There's kind of bare ground over here. And I've got this beautiful oak tree too. It's actually kind of struggling a little bit, but it's still a beautiful oak tree. So just thinking about, your yard, even in this small space, there's quite a lot of different habitat. And when it does snow or ice over, the wildlife, the insects particularly, are going to hunker down in these places, and they're going to make it through the winter. And then you're going to have more food for bats in the spring. So just something to think about. The other thing is water. So I know if it's super cold, you're not going to have water in your yard. It's going to be frozen. And in that case, that's great. It doesn't matter. The bats aren't going to come out. It's too cold for them too. But as I mentioned, sometimes when bats are hibernating, there are cases where, especially in warmer, kind of more southern areas of the US, they may wake up, they may want to go get a drink of water. Because I mean, I don't know about you, I'm thirsty when I wake up after one night of sleep. I can't imagine waking up after hibernating for a while. And I'm sure they're incredibly thirsty. And bats need about 7 to 10 feet of water to drink. So putting out a bird bath is not going to work for bats. They don't perch and drink. They actually swoop down and drink on the wing is what we call it. But you'll see they swoop down, they open their little mouths, and then they scoop up water. And that's what's happening in this picture. It's a very impressive acrobatic feat for them to drink like that. So if you have a pond, or a water trough, or, if you live near a creek or a lake or a stream or something like that, that's fantastic, because if that water is not frozen, if it's warm enough, for the water to unfreeze, then potentially the bats may come out and have a drink. So, if you can offer water in your yard for bats, that's really helpful. I know, not everyone can have a 7 to 10 foot space of water in their yard, and that's totally fine. I will say if you do have water and you notice that, things are using it, which they probably are, it's good to buy a wildlife escape ramp. These are fairly cheap. You can buy them online. You can buy them from almost anywhere, but it's just a little ramp that goes into the water. And then if something falls in, they're able to get out, because bats actually can swim, which is, hard to imagine, but they can do it. And if they fall into water, they'll just kind of truck around the side of wherever they're in, kind of looking for a way out. So if you have an escape ramp, that's really good for all kinds of wildlife, and then you don't have to worry about it. So yeah, water is important, always important for wildlife, especially bats. Step 5, or recommendation 5, plant if you can, plant if you can't. So here in Central Texas, we sort of have 2 growing seasons, which is kind of awesome, which makes up for our very hot and rough summer. I know it's technically fall right now, but it's still very warm here, so it's hard for me to wrap my head around that. But, starting at the end-ish of September to kind of the middle of November, we can actually plant things. And we're actually recommended to plant trees from late fall into early spring. So winter is actually our tree planting season. So if you live in a place like that, and you know that you can plant things that time of year, go for it. Sometimes that's a good time to try out different things. Climate and weather have been so wacky these last few years that, sometimes you'll plant a bunch of stuff and it won't make it, and then sometimes things will. So it's just kind of trial and error, and, it's okay to try something and fail and try again. And so if you can plant, if you can add native plants to your yard or your garden or whatever, go for it. If you can't, that's okay too. This space right here, this brown dirt right here, was it's a bat garden now, but before it was just an empty space. And this is a little red bat, not a real bat, obviously, a stuffed bat, looking over the garden, imagining how beautiful it's going to be. So with this, I'm just saying winter's a good time to kind of sit back and take stock in your yard or your garden and think about, what's working, what's not working, what could you add more of, what is done really well. Sometimes you plant natives and they'll die. Sometimes you plant natives and they'll take over. And sometimes that's a good thing. I think it's a good thing. I love volunteer plants that just kind of, because they do well there. They're selecting themselves to be there. So you're not trying to force it. So generally they don't need as much care to maintain. So think about what did well this year in your yard and what didn't. And then maybe kind of make plans for next year, and you'll be ready to go in the spring once it warms up and you can plant again. So it's a good time to just take stock. You can do that. If you can't plant, just see what you can do next year. And then the last thing I wanted to mention is bat houses. We get a ton of bat house questions at BCI, and generally I will say nature hates blanket statements. So I'm sure there's exceptions to this, but usually bats are not going to spend the winter in a bat house, especially in colder areas. Bat houses are not warm enough. The temperature fluctuates too much. They're too exposed. So bats are not going to hibernate in a bat house. It just doesn't work. So if you have a bat house and it's not occupied currently, and if you're not sure, you can hang out at dusk and try to see if anything's flying out. Usually in the winter, they're going to be unoccupied, but it's always good to check. Or you can put like a white cloth underneath your bat house and see if any guano accumulates over a couple of days. And if you're like, I can't tell if this is rat poop or mouse poop, or is it bat poop, bat guano is actually shiny because of all the insects they eat. Their guano has sort of an iridescent quality. So you can kind of look at it and see if it shines in the light, and then that's a sign that it's actually bat guano. So that's a nice non-invasive way to check your bat house. We don't recommend shining lights up there. That can be really disturbing. So it's good to make sure your bat house is not occupied. If it's not, and you feel like it's been up there for a long time, you can take it down and just, figure out if it's in good shape still. Sometimes they fall apart just over the course of many years. So, check it out, make sure it's in good shape, make sure there's no places where the bats can get stuck or trapped or anything like that. We used to recommend bat houses that had mesh or wire on the inside for the bats to grab. We no longer recommend that. That is not recommended anymore because the mesh and the wire can actually break down over time and the bats can get stuck. So if you have an older bat house and you can take it down and actually take the wire or the mesh out, that's great if you can do that. We actually recommend roughing up the inside with sandpaper, and that makes enough place for the bats to actually be able to grip, so they don't need the mesh or the wire. So if you can take down your bat house, sometimes you'll get mud dauber or dirt dauber wasp nests in there. Sometimes you'll get paper wasp nests, all sorts of things. I've had someone say that they had like wood digging bees in their bat house. So it's a good time to take down the bat house, again, if you can. And if it's only been up there for a year or a couple of years, then I would just leave it unless you notice that there are wasps in there. Or if it's been up there for a while and it hasn't been occupied at all, it might be time to take it down, make sure everything's okay, and then maybe try a different spot. Because bats are going to come back and visit the bat house, and hopefully in the spring, and hopefully they will occupy your bat house. And I just wanted to say, bat houses are great for certain species of bats. Certain species of bats will use bat houses, the larger kind of colonial roosting bats will use bat houses, but there's a lot of species of bats that will not use a bat house. There's a lot of solitary tree roosting bats that will not use your bat house. So bat houses are great, but I would recommend doing a bat garden first, because that is supplying insects to all the bat species. And then adding a bat house as kind of a supplementary thing to your bat garden is fine. And, in certain areas of the country, they're going to be more successful than others. Here in Texas, we have Mexican free-tailed bats. They love bat houses. They tend to occupy them fairly easily. But, if you live farther up north, it might be harder to attract bats. So that's just kind of the way it is. So a bat garden helps all the bats. It's not as obvious. You may not see the bats in your yard feeding on the insects, but just know that you're kind of supporting this robust insect population, that it's going to help your local bats that are very much there. So lots of bat house information. Happy to take questions about this. I have a feeling there might be more. And then just generally, these apply for all times of the year. We just want to make sure we follow our bat-friendly yard tips. So as I mentioned, having an organic garden is great, but keeping your lawn organic too, and all your land organic is really important. I have people tell me, I just spray for mosquitoes. I don't spray for anything else. But unfortunately, there isn't a spray that exists that just kills mosquitoes. You're killing all the good bugs too. So I know it's hard because I know mosquitoes are terrible. Nobody likes them. Bats do eat mosquitoes. I will say some mosquitoes are pollinators. So, there's that. They're not as black and white evil as you might think. But, if you're not using pesticide and you're planting all these native plants, you're going to support more insects. And some of those insects, are going to be things that eat mosquitoes, like dragonflies and spiders and robber flies and things like that. So more native plants, makes it a more healthy population of insects where you may not have an overabundance of just one type of pest. And then obviously, the bats are going to be there if the bugs are there. So if you're spraying, the bugs aren't going to be there. So just thinking about keeping your yard as organic as possible. Keeping your cat inside. I don't think this is really much of an issue in the winter. Hopefully you're not leaving your cat outside at night in the winter. That seems kind of mean. But if you live in a warmer place, I don't know. I will let a bird person yell at you about keeping your cat inside during the day, because that is a whole huge issue with feral cats and birds. I will say that, a cat will eat a bat if they get a hold of a bat. I don't think it happens that often, but it is something that does happen. So, keeping them inside at night when bats are out is just better for everybody. The cat too. And then keeping your yard as dark as possible. If you're living in a suburban or urban area, there is tons of light pollution. There's just so much light pollution in the world now. It's kind of nuts just how high of a level it's gotten to. So if you can kind of keep your yard dark, it's going to be a better habitat for a lot of different things, including bats. You may see bats flying, around lights at night. I've definitely seen them catching insects around streetlights and things like that. So sometimes they will go to lights if the lights are attracting bugs. But in general, because there is so much light pollution, sometimes all that light, all that feedback can really mess with their ability to echolocate properly. So if you keep your yard dark, you're creating kind of this nice little oasis in this like sea of light pollution. And then going along with that, we also want to think about noise pollution too, which I don't have on here, but bats can hear really well. They echolocate to get around, which means they are using sound to interpret their environment. So the more noise pollution that's there, the harder that may be. So just kind of thinking about keeping your yard as quiet as possible too is good. It's just one of those things. So there's a lot of different things that you can do to just make your yard more wildlife friendly. And these are just some of my amazing suggestions. So with that, we have a gardening for bat guide on our website at batcon.org. Feel free to reach out to me too, if you want to email, if you have questions or anything like that, and I will take questions.
So Erin, we had a question about the use of pesticides. How is that impacting bats?
I think so. This is a great question. I have a feeling, if bats are eating insects that are exposed to pesticide, it's not good for them in the long term. But I think that's something we're still sort of trying to figure out. But I will say that, the more insects that you're killing, the less available food is for bats. Or sorry, less food there is available for bats. So that's kind of the main issue. There's just so many chemicals in the environment at this point that we really just want to limit that and reduce that as much as possible, because it's just not a healthy thing. So, I have a feeling bats that are eating insects that are exposed to pesticides, I don't think overall that's very healthy for them, though a lot of bats do. We have a lot of bats that are eating crop pests, and those pests have probably been exposed to pesticides. So it's complicated. It's a complicated thing. But I think just generally keeping your yard organic and not using those chemicals is the best option for kind of everything in the ecosystem.
We have had a lot of questions about owls. So Seth asks, what about owls in urban locations? Do we need to be aware of that? And then Tony asks if there's a way to help the great horned owls and the bats that are in his yard coexist.
He has both in his yard at the same time. Huh, that's interesting. So yeah, owls are bat predators. Bats are small, so I don't think, it depends on the species, but great horned owls are pretty large and they tend to eat larger prey from what I understand. So I don't think they would spend a lot of time chasing down a bat just because they are small and it's not, it's not a lot of energy for all that work. So, I think bats and owls coexist, in native habitats anyway, and it's going to happen in urban environments too. I think if you have an owl house and it's occupied and you put up a bat house, bats may not occupy that bat house. It might be because of the owl, it might be for 100 other different reasons. But, I think they coexist already, whether we provide, owl houses or not. So it's kind of one of those things that it just happens and it's an interaction that happens. And I don't think there's much we can do to kind of make that better, except to just support healthy populations of both.
We had a question from Ted. He says, I'm in Florida where it's warm all year. I have a bat box in our backyard with many bats living in there. However, recently I've found about 4 or 5 dead bats in the yard. Is this common? Here we have the Florida bonneted bats.
Oh, yes, you do. So it's hard to know exactly why those bats died, Ted. It's possible they were overheating. That is an issue with bat houses sometimes. And when it gets really, really hot, if they don't have other places to go, if the bat house is kind of the only thing left, and they can't go anywhere else, they may end up overheating and dying in the bat houses. And that's been happening more and more frequently with climate change. And so there's actually a couple of people, there's one professor in particular that is researching, and we've actually been doing this in Florida with the bonneted bat, trying to understand the best model of bat house to kind of deal with these more extreme temperatures. So that's sort of kind of an evolving thing that we're trying to understand. And the recommendation that we have on our website and the general bat houses that you see, it's kind of a one size fits all approach. And, that bat house recommendations on our website, that's like from a study that was like 15 years ago, and just kind of an idea of like, okay, this worked the best out of all the other options. So, I think that our bat house recommendations are probably going to change a little bit as we learn more. And I think people are trying out a lot of different new materials to try to see like what keeps the heat out the best. But I think more than anything, we just want to, recognize that bat houses are not one-to-one mitigation for loss of natural habitat, So we just want to protect as much natural habitat as we can so that the bats, if they choose to occupy a bat house, that's great, but we don't want them to be trapped there where they can't go anywhere else. And again, I don't know if that's why the bats died. Could be for other things too, but we have gotten a lot of, people telling us that the bats have been overheating in their house, which is just really sad, but it's become definitely more common.
Since you were talking about bat houses, I'm going to skip ahead to a question about bat houses. Rebecca asks about how many bats will fit in a bat house, and is there a way to attract them other than providing plant habitat? And she's in Lakeway, Texas.
Okay, it depends on the bat house. So we have, so there are 1-chamber bat houses that we used to recommend. We no longer recommend them. We recommend 3 to 4 chamber bat houses, and the chambers are just the inside parts where the bats hang out. And those can hold hundreds of bats, surprisingly, because they really cram in there, like really, and they're not very big. If you're in Texas, it's going to be the Mexican freetails. We've seen them under the Bridge of Congress, like they love to cram into spaces together and hang out. So generally, the bat houses that we recommend can hold a lot of bats. And then what was the other question? Sorry, I totally lost it.
How to attract them other than providing plant habitat.
Yeah, so no, there's really not. And this is a whole thing now that there is like pheromone spray, there's guano, people sell bat pee, like all sorts of things that say like, if you put this on your bat house, the bats will come. And it doesn't work. None of it works. Like that's not going to bring bats to your bat house. So the best thing you can do is just follow our, recommendations on where to put it. We recommend don't put it on a tree. That's a huge mistake we see all the time. It makes sense. You're like, oh, it's on a tree. That's a natural habitat. But we found that those bat houses are less likely to be occupied because they're much more vulnerable to predators in trees. So we recommend, 20 to 30 feet away from the nearest tree. They like it hot, but not too hot. So facing kind of east or southeast is the best direction. 12 to 20 feet from the ground, because bats need a lot of clearance to fly out. And then just kind of crossing your fingers. So, I know it's frustrating to have a bat house and not have bats every single year, have no bats visit your bat house. And I would say if it's been in a spot for more than 2 years, it might be time to try a new spot and just, there's a lot of nuance to it and it's trial and error. And I don't know, you can't force them to live there. You just hope you make it nice enough that they want to visit.
We get a question about stray cats. So this participant says we have stray cats everywhere and they're always in the backyard. How can we keep the cats away without deterring insects for the bats?
That is really hard. I mean, it's complicated. I don't know if
I will say I have a friend who swears by, I have a friend who swears by coyote urine. I don't know where he buys it. But anything that is a predator to a cat to scare them away and will have zero effect on insects. I don't know. I haven't tried it myself, but.
Yeah, it's an issue. Like, I mean, there are places in the US where they actually have a feral cat like season where they hunt them, which I know sounds horrible, but they do so much damage to birds and insects and lizards, and they eat everything. And it's just really complicated. I'm not advocating that at all. I mean, I think just trying to make your yard as secure as possible, but it's just so hard to keep them out. I don't know. I like Karen's idea. Let's try a coyote pee and see how that goes.
I mean, I've heard cayenne pepper too. I don't know.
Oh, there you go. Who knows? If anyone has a good idea, please put it in the chat.
Yes. We had another question about HOAs. So do you have any advice for folks who live with homeowners associations that mandate, raking leaves and trimming the palm trees?
That's really hard. I know that's like a struggle that a lot of people face. I mean, I think the best thing to do is to just kind of collectively start working on getting your neighbors on board with what you're trying to do and talking to people and just trying to kind of petition the HOA to change their regulations. It depends on where you live. Sometimes the HOA has their rules, but then like the city or town where you live might have different rules related to vegetation for wildlife. Like here in Austin, you're allowed to have vegetation for wildlife if your yard is certified as a wildlife habitat through NWF, which is, just so it's one of those things like getting your yard as many of those like certifications as you can, I think helps. And then just talking to people and having them try to understand like why this is important. I think it's really hard. There is just this collective need in humans to kind of keep things neat and tidy. And it's gonna, it takes a lot of work to kind of shift that idea in people's minds, but I think it's, picking up steam. People are excited about pollinators. Maybe just start with butterflies, honestly. Just start with like some butterfly plants because everyone likes butterflies and hummingbirds. Start with them. And a lot of those plants work for bats too and night insects. So, if you're talking about the monarchs, like I think that would get people on board. So maybe starting, I hate to say like more charismatic wildlife because I think bats are incredibly charismatic, but I know not everyone believes that. I would say starting with kind of the wildlife that people are generally like pretty cool with initially, and maybe going from there. I don't know. It's a lot of work. It's tough. And I respect that you're thinking about it and maybe trying to do it. That's great.
All right, so we are about out of time. Thank you, Erin, for all of this great information, and thanks to the audience for joining us. I've put in the chat the link to find out more about bat gardening and bat houses. For those of you watching on Facebook, that's going to be batcon.org. Choose About Bats in the left menu, and you'll see bat gardens and houses. If you haven't already, I hope you'll subscribe to our mailing list and our newsletter to stay in the know about upcoming webinars and the work that we do. This webinar will be uploaded to our YouTube channel within the next couple of days, so be on the lookout for that. Any last words for us, Erin, before we sign off?
No, I mean, I think that you can make a surprising amount of difference by making your yard friendly for wildlife. And I think, once you do it, just talk to your neighbor about it, and you can start like a whole thing in your neighborhood, and hopefully it expands. The more back gardens we have, the more they kind of combine into this like, collective green space that's available for all kinds of wildlife. So just know that, it's hard to kind of face some of these huge challenges we have in conservation, but like just starting in your yard is a really good thing to do, and it's an easy thing to do, and it's fun too. So I would say go for it. You can do it. You're awesome. Thank you so much for listening to me talk. I appreciate it. Thank you, Karen.
Yeah. Thanks so much, everybody. I hope that you found this as helpful as I did. I know I'm eager to get outside working on my bat garden, and hopefully you are too. And we'll see you at the next bat chat. Thanks so much.
All right.
Bye.